Today's guest is Tom Wayman. Tom Wayman is a great Canadian poet. He's an icon, he's a gem. He's been doing poetry both here and, internationally since the 60s. He's one of these people that will guide you if you read his books. If you read his books, you will find out so much. And also read about Appledore. He has this interesting place that he has created called Appledore. And it's really mystical and it's really real. He has been writer-in-residence at University of Windsor, University of Alberta, Simon Fraser University, University of Winnipeg, University of Toronto. He's taught at U of C. He's on many boards. He lives out in the Kootenays. He lives a beautiful life that he writes about, and he writes about politics as well. His point of view is always interesting. He has 20 books of poetry. He has 3 books of short fiction, and he's in many anthologies. Check out his website. And today's guest, I'm honored to present Tom Wayman.
You don't have an actual clapper. No.
This is my clapper. And here we have Tom Wayman.
There was a guy in the Kootenays I knew who had an interview show on the Co-op radio, and he would make fun of my name, but his name is Jeff Pilsner. So as I kept pointing out to him, I'm not a good guy to, if you have a name like Pilsner, to make fun of.
What's to make fun of?
Well, playing with, he used to do that too, draw it out.
Oh, I was just doing it as a sound agitprop.
Okay.
Because I remember when, of course you remember, when there was the oui and no vote in Quebec.
Oh, yes.
The oui and no vote. And I was there right after that vote, and I guess the vote went different than the government thought it was going to go.
It was much closer.
And I was really high, and I was walking along the park, and I was in Ottawa, and I was walking along, and everything was just so beautiful, and then I suddenly heard, Margaret Atwood! And I was like, what's going on? What's going on? What is going on? And I started walking up the Parliament, and they had Margaret Atwood's face projected on the front of the Parliament buildings, and it went like this, right up the pillar, and then they had like Thompson Highway, and Thompson's face was going all over and it was huge, like a 3D projection. So now...
Wait, why?
Why? I don't know.
Okay.
I never really understood it, except I knew that it had something to do with the government spending a lot of money to celebrate Canada in a new way. And then it didn't really work out because the project kind of backfired on them. And I phoned the newspaper and I said, where did that money, the funding for that agitprop projection on the front of the Parliament building, nobody wanted to talk about it. Anyway, I always talk about it since then because I felt like I knew something ahead of my time, but I probably didn't anyway, whatever. But then, now whenever I think of an amazing artist in Canada, I think of their name and I think, Tom Wayman, because I see your face projected on the front of the Parliament buildings.
They would probably crumble.
Oh, you mean the stones themselves? I think
Yeah.
they did crumble. I think they are crumbling, speaking of which.
No, that's a good story. I had no idea that they went to those lengths. It sounds a bit like Big Brother.
Yeah, it was Big Brother.
Only Big Sister.
And Big Sister. Yes, and big faces. And they had these stands that were all set up for people to watch these faces, these ghostly faces with these big names, and they were projected in this way. And the stands were empty.
You're talking to someone who when the Olympics were in Montreal, each province sent a delegation, and I was in the an arts delegation, as well, and I was in the BC one, and they had booked us in to read poems in the middle of a public park at 11 p.m. So there was no one there, as you might imagine. That was kind of BC's. I think there were 3 poets, and we were supposed to entertain the grass and the Canada geese and stuff with a little slice of British Columbia culture. So, yeah.
The poets really do
But
get.
man, we got a trip to Montreal, put up in a hotel, and a trip back home. So
Yeah, so how can you hate that?
no, right.
But at the same time, it would be so good for people to hear the poetry.
Well, yeah, or spend the money on something more worthwhile.
Yeah. So, you just had a new book come out.
Yeah, actually, I had 2 books out in April. I had a memoir about moving to southeastern British Columbia, to the Slocan Valley, and then I had a book of poems out that's sort of complementary. It's mostly set in that milieu in the valley.
And what is the title of the memoir?
The memoir is called "The Road to Appledore," or "How I Went Back to the Land Without Ever Having Lived There in the First Place."
That's good.
Yeah, well, it's meant to be lighthearted. It's kind of the book I wish I had been able to read in 1989 when I moved from the urban to the rural. So it's sort of a how not to book as well as a how to book.
Oh.
In terms of moving, people move from the urban to the rural thinking it'll be just like urban life but with more scenery. And of course it isn't. It is in its own way a different culture, and it calls on you to have a different skill set, which in my case I learned the hard way, and that's what the book's about. But it's hopefully lighthearted and funny as well.
Oh.
And then the book of poems is called "How Can You Live Here," which is what visitors have said. And so the book the book of poems sort of attempts to answer that. And it's
And how can you?
well, you'd have to read the book.
I will read the book.
No.
But you didn't bring me one because you sold out.
Yeah, I'll get.
And
well,
like
just on this little trip, but I'll get you copies of both of
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
At
Because, I
as soon as I
read,
get home.
I literally read everything that you have ever written.
Wow.
And I highly recommend, if you want to be a writer, that Tom Wayman is one of the people you definitely read everything he has ever done, and you will learn a huge amount, because part of it is the poetry and the craft of the poetry and the point of view, of course, the degree of authenticity, which is really strong, and also for me it's the different approaches to poetry that you can take.
Well, thank you very much. It's
From improvisation, so when I think of your books, I think of opening the book and then first reading, "This is how I approached this work."
Yeah. Well, okay. So a couple things. I believe that poems are text for speaking, right? So there's none of my poems are not speakable, if you know what I mean.
Yes, they're all oral.
Yeah. And the second thing is that I try, especially in the more, the last half dozen or so, to have prose introductions to each section, so it gives people an idea of what I'm trying to do. They can then judge for themselves whether the poems live up to the expectation or intention, I guess is better said. And I know some people object to that. They think poems ought to just speak for themselves, but I still find it useful to be able to talk about what I'm doing, just given that so many people are turned off poetry in school, and they have a mental picture of how awful it is, and then I think explaining what you're doing doesn't hurt.
Well, I totally didn't take it from that.
Okay.
When I would read your work, I would read the intention, let's call it, as a prompt for me to learn something about poetry for myself. Maybe I'm just completely self-centered, but I didn't see it as a prompt to judge your work, but more to inspire me to see the possibilities of poetry and see the for me a possibility of approach.
Okay.
And of how to enter into this way of seeing, or this way of speaking, or this this delicate way of observing the world, even.
Well, yeah. What you're doing is what when I was teaching we called reading as a writer. Like you're reading to see what works and what doesn't work in another writer's efforts, and I think that's super important. I mean, I do that too with other people. If I like it, why do I like it? If I'm bored by it, what's boring about it? It's just I think not all poetry readers read as writers. And so it's maybe them I'm trying to help understand what I'm doing with the prose introductions. Also,
or maybe even instruct them as to how to become a writer.
Yeah, well that's it. I mean, I've certainly had people tell me, because this happened on this last one, that they said they heard my poems on CBC and said, well, geez, if that's poetry, I can write poetry, and then began to do so. And now they've got books and so on. So maybe I'm the lowest common denominator.
Oh, well, if you're the lowest common denominator, I can't imagine what the lowest common denominator is, because, your work is, I would say, I would go so far, and I don't throw these things around, as divine.
Jeez. Okay.
It's divine, and it's just so, for me, it's personal, and yet it's universal. So you make the space of a poet personal, but it has a universal view of the world.
Well, thank you. If that is true, it's because I think of models. When I started to write, it was writers, say American writers like Kenneth Rexroth or Robert Bly or Denise Levertov, all of whom, I would say were divine. I feel like, and certainly amazing models. And then in Canada, people like Al Purdy or Bernie Dorothy Livesey again, trying to translate the world into words in a way that had both kind of an awareness of nature, an awareness of history, an awareness of politics, an awareness of people in all their kind of work glory, and so that's, I guess, those have been my models that try to find, with a little Sheri-D Wilson thrown in for energy. For
energy. I think work model. Okay, you brought it up, and I'll just go with that, because a lot of your work, a lot of your poems have to do with, and I know that you teach this as well, of how to express the work that you do in poems.
Yeah. Well, I had begun writing about jobs I had, because like I had gone to university at UBC, and then I won some money. I was supposed to go on in a career in newspapering. I was trained as a newspaper guy, and we worked on the Vancouver Sun every summer and then on the student paper every winter. So I was supposed to just go and do that, but I won some money to study creative writing, and then that changed my life, because I thought, whoa, this is way more fun the newspaper, mostly because you could cover a wider range of events. Like working on the Sun, it was basically crime, fires, service club luncheons, speeches, that sort of thing. It wasn't the whole spectrum of humanity, whereas obviously literature does cover that. And then when I got back to Canada, it was a recession, and so I began to work manual jobs.
Oh, that from California, when you came back from California?
Yeah, actually, I taught for a year in Colorado,
Yeah.
and it was a pretty wild year, so they didn't renew my contract, as they politely put it. And so I came back, and when I was working manual jobs and thinking about those, I began to write about them, and then looked around to see who else was writing about daily work, and found this huge hole in our literature, and then began to think about why that might be, and encourage other people to fill in the hole, as it were. Again, one of the models was exactly what women were doing. If you think about it, with the rise of feminist writing, that here was supposed to be the literature of humanity. It just didn't include the experiences of women, and so this was like a shadow of that. Didn't include the experiences of work either. And so ever since then, I've been fascinated by that, and so it remains an interest. There's a new generation of those writers who are in Canada anyway, that are trying to link issues of the environment with daily work. And I think that's good, because I actually don't think you can save the planet without rethinking what happens on jobs and who has power, who doesn't, at the workplace. So it's exciting to see that roll on.
Yeah, and I think of Hilary Peach's new book.
Yes.
And her experiences as, what is it? Boilermaker.
Yeah,
which,
or Kate Braid.
Kate Braid. And
as a carpenter. And
as
so
a carpenter.
The women in trades thing has always involved self-expression. And so poetry is a natural connection with that. There's a woman in Oakland, California, Sue Doro, who for many years has run a magazine about women in trades called Pride in a Paycheck. This is the old meaning of pride, meaning being proud of having these new skills.
Yes.
But in every issue, she has work memoir and work poetry. And at these conferences of women in trades, there's a thing like Women Build California, Women Build whatever state, and then there's Women Build America. She always has a little writing workshop thing called Blue Jean Pocket Writers Workshop, and uses prompts and examples and just gets people writing about it. So, and Sudor herself, she was a machinist, of course, the first woman machinist on a railway in Milwaukee. Doing things like these gigantic railway wheels, have to be all fine-tuned and stuff. But again, you'd really like her. She and her husband had a comedy team before they became machinists and stuff like that.
Oh.
So they've never lost a sense of humor, perspective, and a real interest in people, which I think is important too.
And is that important to poetry?
Pardon?
Is that important to poetry, an interest in people?
Oh yeah, of course. Yes, I think of all writing that we're really capturing, I think, directly or indirectly, how human beings are coping with being alive.
And how to cope.
Yeah.
Because poets do observe these things, spend more time maybe thinking about how to cope and how to navigate, and what you can do with your thinking to change your thinking in order to bring change to not only your own environment, but the environment of other people.
Yes, and I've always said our advantage is that there's no money in poetry. So, so we can't be corrupted, right? Because no one's going to make a buck off of what we say.
Yeah.
And that turns out to be a unique vantage point. Like, for example, I like to cross country ski, and there's a national organization of Canadian cross country ski clubs. And if they have a magazine, and if you pick it up, it's all about buying this and buying that. You're supposed to have like a $600 outfit to get out on a pair of slippery slats and fall over. And like even that gets kind of corrupted into money. And the fun of it, which is basically being out in the winter woods and enjoying that, suddenly, you have to buy this to look right, or this piece of equipment. There's nothing like that in poetry. No one cares what you look like, or it's your observation and thinking, and then the transmuting that into words that is important.
I totally agree with that. It is a form of alchemy, as you say, transmutating. It is a form of alchemy, and there is definitely no money in it. When I think of that, I think of Anne Waldman's book, The Outrider, where she talks about why to become a writer. And please, if you think that you're going to make lots of money and it's going to be this great mind-bending career move in which you will make money, and maybe you will, nowadays you maybe have more of an opportunity to make money than in your generation, my generation, like. However, it's not the thing that propels people into poetry,
Yes,
and then also keeps them there, because it's the love of words, ideas, sounds, perceptions, and transformations.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think also discovery, because as I get older, I find these new things are continually opening, and possibilities of ways to see and express that. And I can't believe there's still so much to explore. Like there's way more than, and as you get older, there's more to explore. It's not like you're like, you get somewhere, because you get nowhere. Not only do you have no money, not only is it going to be that shitty thing, but it's going to be, you arrive nowhere.
Well, it's also like the longer you live, the less you know. It's kind of the idea.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
when you're younger, you know everything, and then as you grow older, you slowly realize you know less and less.
Yeah, and then you read one book like Blavatsky or something, and you suddenly go, oh my God. Oh my God. There's a whole new world just opened up.
Yeah.
That I didn't even know about. And
Yeah.
Who kept this secret from me?
No, and it's true with poetry. Like I constantly find poets I didn't know about who've been having a career of their own,
Mm-hmm.
and doing things that, whoa, this looks really interesting.
Yeah.
So it is exactly as you say, a continual discovery. But even inside the dictionary, like now I've taken, to checking certain words that I've always used. I think, gee, I wonder if I'm using those right, and I'm double checking them, and sometimes I find that there's shades of meaning that I thought it shaded this way and it actually doesn't, and so I have to find a different word, and so that's new, to discover big parts of the dictionary that previously I was sure I knew, but now I'm not so sure. Kind of
There's that in the simple words, and then for me there are in the last 5-10 years the words that have been left behind,
Yes.
words that express perfectly what I want to express and are not being used at all anymore, words that are very interesting in sound and meaning. Like we were talking about honorifiabilitudinatibus, this word that Shakespeare just created, and it means being in the state of honor. And I was like, wow, I just love the whole concept of that word that got left behind that we don't use anymore or know. And I mean, I could go on on that level.
Well, other words get taken over by advertising campaigns, and then you can't use them. That's the thing.
Oh,
I discover.
like Apple?
Well, yeah, or I was driving over here behind. There's a Nissan has an electric vehicle called the Leaf, and I thought, geez, what a shame, because the word Leaf appears in lots of my.
Or a new car called Lucid.
Okay.
I was like, are you kidding me?
Yeah. Well.
Oh.
Anyway,
I wish they'd called the car maybe ovoid.
It's part of a living language, though, so to give it its due.
Yes.
That some words fall away and new words show up, or you have to make do with.
And words do transform.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's unfortunate when they become something that they aren't.
So it's not different than an artist working with color, I often think. So, they can generate new colors. They can avoid certain colors because another artist has overused them or whatever. So I think almost any art form, it is exactly what you said, a constant process of discovery and learning, and that's in a way what makes it fun.
I agree with that.
It
So I do want to ask you a question.
okay.
I don't think I've asked you a question yet. I do want to ask a question, and the question is, who are your influences and or mentors when you were younger?
Well, I was very, very lucky in that my father was a great reader of poetry, and in our house growing up, he liked to declaim certain 19th century Canadian poets. Wilfred Campbell, Along the Line of Smoky Hills, the Crimson Forest stands, and all day long the blue jay calls throughout the autumn land. And he loved A.E. Housman his whole life. From Clee to Heaven the beacons burn, the shires have seen it plain. From north and south the signs go forth and beacons burn again. Look left, look right, the hills are bright, the dales are bright between, because 'tis 50 years tonight that God has saved the Queen. It's a poem about the 50th anniversary of Victoria taking the throne, but it turns into quite an anti-imperialist thing by the end. He says the saviors, meaning God, as in God save the Queen, the saviors come not home tonight, themselves they could not save. It dawns in Asia, tombstones show, and Shropshire names are read, and the Nile spills its overflow beside the Severn's dead. We pledge in peace by town and farm. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on, but it turns into quite a. His last word is, "Get you the sons your fathers got, and God will save the Queen." Yeah. So anyway, my dad liked that, and then both he and my mother had been active in the Toronto left, which included a lot of poets or people around poetry. Dorothy Livesey, Miriam Waddington, Earl Burney's wife Esther was a social worker the way my mom was. This is very beginnings of social work in Canada. So they were all kind of pioneers of that. They all knew each other. So our house was always filled with contemporary poetry. He had some of the first books of poems by this young guy, Leonard Cohen. And so I grew up with that, thinking kind of that was normal, like that poetry was a big part of everyone's life. And then when I went to UBC, it was full of poets. So Earl Burney, I took writing seminars with Earl Burney, and he knew my parents because of his wife Esther. he brought Al Purdy in. I'd never, to read, and I'd never heard Purdy. And he had Irving Layton in. And then Bernie was having a big fight with an academic poet who Roy Daniels, who also published poems widely. So you got your first sense of poetry wars. And then Bernie was also going head to head with Warren Tallman, who brought up the San Francisco poets, the Black Mountain poets, and so as a young person, this was all really interesting. That there were many schools of poetry, that there were literary gangs and literary muggings, and it made it all pretty exciting. And then I did, like I say, instead of going on directly to the Sun, I won this scholarship to go to graduate school in Southern California. And all my peers knew about a whole lot of American poets that I had never heard of. Phil Levine, the whole group out of Iowa, Donald Justice, and so on. And then, and that was a world, where they fought with, or didn't like, the San Francisco people or the New York writers, right? The New York school, and so it stayed interesting. But the 2 years I was in California doing grad school, University of California had endless amounts of money, so we had a visiting writer every week, and it was, some of them were incredible. Oh. We had David Garnett, whose mother did all the translations from Russian of the classics, and we talked about growing up in that world. We had a guy called Saul Maloff, who was the book review editor of Newsweek, which at the time was big, and he said to us, there are no bookstores outside New York City. Everybody gasped. I asked him what a bookstore was. He said, it's where you can get uncut versions of French novels, meaning the pages aren't cut open yet.
Oh my God.
So, that real New York deal, like here I am in California, wherever that is. And so it was all pretty exciting. And then you asked about mentors. Well, Robert Bly came, and very flamboyant guy. In those days he wore this long serape. He'd say, and he was big on translations, on bringing into North American writing this whole world that now people are familiar with, but in those days, a foreign writer was from England, sort of things. And so there's Bly. It's a translation of Garcia Lorca in New York, the big surrealist poet New York thing, and then he's gonna go to Cuba. He's gonna be back in the Spanish language. This is Bly waving his hands around. Back in the Spanish language culture. I'm going to Santiago in a carriage of black water. I'm going to Santiago, and he did the whole thing, and my mind was kind of blown. Wow, you can do that with poetry? Remember, I hadn't seen you yet, so I didn't know you could do all these things.
Oh, well, that's what Ginsberg did for me.
Okay.
I actually, he was reading Plutonium, and unfortunately, it was at Naropa, and unfortunately there was no seats left, so I had to sit close to him, and he was doing Plutonium, and I passed out. I literally fell off my chair onto the ground and peed myself because I passed out.
Wow.
Like, it was so overwhelming to my whole being that I passed out. Like, poets have a lot of energy.
Some do.
Yes. Well, the ones that don't, I don't really go for, but I go for the energetic. I go for people who have the soul, that I can perceive.
Yeah, I actually know what you mean, because the two in my life where I've been around them and felt what the Beatles called, another kind of mind. And one was Bly and the other was Gary Snyder, believe it or not.
Oh yeah, Gary Snyder.
And I mean, there was just some aura, or I don't know what you call it, but you were clearly, or I felt I was clearly in the presence of something else than ordinary. Yeah. Even though they were both very personable.
Yeah.
have their own.
Yeah, down to earth and everything like that, but there's a vibration there, or like you say, an aura, like there's something going on. But I think that's true of many poets that I meet, the ones that don't have that other thing. I listen to, but I'm not a fan of. When you write, you must have that, because when I read your work, although most of the time with you, I read your work because I don't get to see you because you live far away, and then, so I don't get to see you, and then I'll be out of town when you're there, and I've only seen you read twice, and I would see you read a lot more if I lived in the Kootenays or close to you. Your work has that vibration, even if it's like if I'm reading it.
Well, thank you.
So I get to go there. Like, it's the thing is like, it's not just being in the presence, the physical presence, but there's something in the vibration of the actual words. It's almost like sacred words or sacred sounds or sounds from a cosmic other place, and it does take you.
Yeah. No. One of the poets that I've discovered late in life is Joseph Stroud from Santa Cruz in California. He's got a cabin in the Sierras, so he spends a certain amount of time in the mountains as well as in the urban. He's got a wonderful poem about going for a walk with a 600-year-old dead Chinese poet. And he's going on and on to the guy about poetry, and then he pauses, and the dead Chinese guy says to him, "Let's go back to your place and drink some wine," which I thought was just great. So he's got that kind of, quirky, interesting. The poems don't go where you think they're gonna go, and that opens up worlds when that happens.
Yeah.
I think, at least for me, it is, and it's not like I think he's the world's greatest poet, but it's just someone I can learn from. That as you say, I've never heard him read. I was gonna go and hear him read in Portland just when the pandemic hit. He was reading in Portland with another poet that I do have a correspondence with down there, and so I was gonna go hear them both. I was real excited, but then the border shut, and I've never had the chance again so far. But like you, I was curious to see what he was like in person, whether that communicated or whether it's just in the words. But
yeah, it generally communicates. And that said, when I read another poet, I do not read silent. I read out loud. I always read poetry out loud. Like, it doesn't matter who I'm reading, because without reading it out loud, I do not get the actual rhythm. I do not get the tone. I don't get the drone. I don't get the underlying. I don't even see between the lines as much. Maybe it's just me, but I always read poetry out loud.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
And if they're a good writer, I should be able to orate their work as they would.
Yeah. You probably have more energy than most of them. Well, you know what I mean. Like, not everybody's a good performer of their own work, even if it's got all that in it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
If you think of well, no, I won't go there. Okay.
Okay. I will ask you one more question.
Sure.
This is Poems by Heart.
Now, the question is kind of convoluted, maybe. I'm working on it. It's sort of the idea that we, as young people, perhaps, we memorize poems. You've already illustrated two of those poems, or two segments of the same poem out loud that you orated. Is there a poem that you memorized when you were young that you had to know in your body?
Not when I was young. At a certain point, I began to memorize Yeats. I went into the hazelwood because a fire was in my head. I cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. And when I laid it on the bank and gone to blow my fire flame, then something rustled on the shore and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair who called me by my name and ran and vanished in the brightening air. Though I am old from wandering through quiet lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she is gone and know her mouth and hold her hand and walk through long, green, dappled grass and pluck till time and times are done. The silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. So I thought, wow, that sounds a lot better aloud than it does on the page, right? That's part of Yeats's, the Celtic Twilight stuff, which people mock because what's in the anthologies is all the later stuff, right? Which is fine, sailing to Byzantium, blah, blah, blah. But I was it somehow seemed important to me because my work's not very romantic to memorize these wonderful romantic poems. Somehow it centered me, and somehow when I write, even if it's some political rant or something, I like to think that the music in Yeats can kind of percolate in somehow. I know he himself is a horrible guy and wrote anthems for the Irish fascists, the blue shirts and all this stuff, but somehow that was one part of his life. And
I go with the Yeats that read in the basement of the Atlantis. I go with the Yeats of the Golden Dawn, and I go with the Yeats of the spiritual enlightenment, and sometimes you get on the wrong side of history, whatever.
Yes.
However, the Yeats that I love, and the Yeats that I love in that poem, is about the discovery of the spirit within himself, and
yes.
the idea of being struck by the lightning bolt of otherness knowledge, and that silver trout that you can catch.
Yeah, yes, with just a berry.
With just a berry.
Yeah, no, there's lots of things to think about.
And the golden sun and what that means.
But also for me personally, the music of it, because often my work is not particularly musical, and I wanted more music in there. That's why, unlike lots of people, I was glad when they gave the Nobel Prize to his Bobness there.
Yeah, I was so happy about the Bobness.
But because especially because there is a very cerebral line of poetry, incomprehensible to most mortals, that gets pushed in the academy, that really has no music, zero music, and the fear is that somehow you'll be sucked into that direction. Whereas if you keep Yeats rattling around in your brain, I think there's less chance of.
Well, yeah, or it was my 30th year to heaven, woke to my hearing from harbour and neighbourwood.
Yes.
I mean, you just go, I know you don't like Dylan Thomas, but how can you not love the music and the sound of the music of the words?
Yes.
And I know it's anti-academy of me, but I love the music of poetry, and that's partly why I write poetry, because of the music of the soul. And we have music in our souls. We each have a song, and that's what I'm trying to get at with the poems that we memorize. Reflect the music and the tremor of our souls that's sitting there waiting to sing.
Plus, it staves off Alzheimer's. to memorize poems.
Plus, it staves off Alzheimer's. Yes, memorize poems.
Yes.
Keep your
absolutely.
mind
Yeah.
intact.
As you get older, that becomes just a little bit more of an issue.
Yeah, and then you do think about it.
Yeah.
Like
And
even
you want to
because you do sort of lose your mind
Oh,
as you get older.
You hope not.
Well, I feel like I lose my mind in certain ways and I gain my mind in another way, which is fine with me. But it would be, staving off Alzheimer's is a good idea. Memorizing poems, good idea.
Yeah. But it's just, you would start off by saying in your youth, and we often were assigned memory, but because it was assigned and not coming from us, then of course you resisted that, or I did anyway, that kind of memorizing. Whereas, I would watch my dad recite things, and it was clear it was out of a love for those poems, not an assignment. And
I never did it as an assignment. If someone gave me the assignment to memorize something, I would only memorize what I wanted.
Okay.
But I've always been like that, I've always had that
Yes.
glitch, which hasn't made me popular in certain ways. But the poems I memorized were always what I felt I had to know
Yeah.
in my soul and carry with me all my life, because you're going to carry it all your life with you. And it's going to inform you. And if you memorize it older, maybe it's like what Leonard Cohen said. That the greatest loves you'll have are the ones you find in older age.
Oh, I didn't know he said that, but he ought to know. And, but no, I think too, there's a way, like sometimes if I'm nervous before giving a reading, then I'll just, in my mind, recite a poem that I like, and then somehow that's calming. It's like, there's many uses to that kind of memorizing.
Yeah.
It's not much in fashion. I think because people see it as an assignment, you must do this, and whether you like the piece or not. But I think if it's self-directed somehow, it really does enlarge your life. Memorizing these things.
I agree.
And I'm kind of a piker at that. I spent a summer working at CBC in Toronto. I was a sort of writer in residence on a show, and the studio director, Gary Katz, who was also in the winter, he was Zosky's studio director on Zosky on FM, that show. And Gary had, I would say, honest to God, maybe 40 or 50 poems by memory. And he did it out of love. He wasn't a writer. His big passion was collecting old Life magazines. But he just liked to do it. And I often found it humbling because, here I was supposed to be the writer in residence, but Gary knew far more in his own way about words and how they worked, and was more in love with words than I was. So
something to observe.
Yeah.
And it's something to observe that, especially with young artists, because the tendency is to only memorize your own work. I really am an advocate of memorizing others and older poems and poems from different languages and different cultures. Like I really, really like the idea of all that churning up inside of your soul.
Yeah,
It's just so, and it can take you places that you never thought. Yeah. Not just places you want to go, but places someone else wants to go, which is the whole thing.
It's an opening, and
yeah.
I would be terrified to memorize my own things because I would feel I was closing myself in, whereas these open up, places I haven't gone or worlds I haven't encountered. And
so what's up for now? What's coming up with you now? What are you going to do now?
Well, okay, so in 2020, a good friend from graduate school, the California poet Dennis Sala, died of a sudden brain bleed, and he was literally working on poems and fell over sideways, and that was it.
It's a good way to go.
I guess. Anyway, a year or so before that time, he had asked me to put together a selected of his. He was someone who couldn't, he'd done a number of books of poems, with small presses, and then he'd done some nonfiction books with big New York houses. He did a book of rock album covers as art, and he did a book of 1950 science fiction movies that had been remade, so science fiction gold, classics, with an essay on each one, linking them to sort of 1950s themes. So how the appearance of aliens matched the kind of McCarthy idea that we're surrounded by aliens.
Yes.
And anyway, but he really couldn't stand being rejected, so he wanted me to put together the book and have me undergo all the rejections of it before it found a home. And so I'm working on that finally now. So 4 years after he died, I finally got my desk cleared. And so that's really interesting because it's going through, poem by poem by poem, sort of 50 years of him as a writer, trying to both find what appeals to me in his writing, because we had somewhat different aesthetics, but also staying true to his aesthetic as much as possible. He believed in kind of constellations, he called them, where you get interested in so he has a book called 100 Chameleons. He got interested in the chameleon because he thought it was a perfect metaphor for similes and metaphors. It's something that's like something else. The chameleon changes to be like a leaf or to be like a branch. And so he worked on that as a constellation. And he got into pomegranates, and he's got a whole bunch of poems about pomegranates. And then his grandparents are from Egypt, and he got into the 22nd dynasty, the Pharaonic dynasty, because that was the one in which smuggling cats out of Egypt was a capital crime. They would be executed for it, because the cat represented the technology, they realized, for keeping the rats out of the granaries. So it was necessary, to preserve grain, to get rid of the, so you couldn't, and then he loved it that the people that did smuggle the cats were Phoenician papyrus traders. So it links up with writing, right? Like,
whoa.
So he loved all these connections and stuff.
It is a constellation.
Yeah, it's not my way of doing things, but again, it's opening up by paying this close attention. Is this a poem that's worth putting in a selected poems? Because in the States, a selected poems is only about 50 poems. So if you've been at it for 50 years, we're talking one poem a year. So I really have to, weigh everything, and it's fun, but it's also a learning process for me.
Wow, that's very, very exciting. Very exciting. I like the idea of constellations. I like the idea of maybe calling them obsessions. I know I get obsessed by certain things, and then I go down these rabbit holes, and and then the rabbit hole leads to another rabbit hole, leads to another rabbit hole, and like I could go from rabbit hole to rabbit hole.
Well, Dennis loved that way of doing it, but he didn't want to call it obsessions. He actually, he studied at Fresno State College, as it was in those days, with the poet Phil Levine, and so he had a really good basis of that. But he went to Arizona State to study psychology, so he was aware of those words like obsession being not good. But anyway, he didn't want to go on with psychology, because he said he realized if someone came in with a problem, he'd probably say to them, "Hey, you're sick, get out of my office." So he switched to creative writing, where he could follow these things. But he was very careful, not to put pejorative, because there's something pejorative about that word, whereas constellations is the sky, and yet it's the same. It's exactly what you said, following your interest, really, or an intense interest.
Well, for me, it's obsessions. He might not like the word, but I don't have a problem with the word, because for me, I do get completely and utterly overtaken, and that's what I mean by it. Like, it's more like obsessed, like overtaken, and I'm gone down the rabbit hole. Some people might not like the rabbit hole, but that's where I am, and the dots between. I like the idea of constellations. I might use that from here on in, because I do love kind of connecting those dots of rabbit holes.
We used to go on, when I went to California, often we'd go on these road trips, and I remember once we're driving on the freeway, and there's you get behind a truck and it's like a billboard, right? So we're cruising along like that, and suddenly Dennis just gets all excited because up at the top of the back of the truck it said, "Everything means something." He thought this was like paradise, like here the world was speaking to us and stuff. But it is kind of interesting, like what trucker would put that on the back? And so you knew you were dealing with an interesting guy.
Well, I remember I was driving in Scotland. I was by myself, and I was going there because I was grieving the loss of my father, and I wanted to go to those stones in Lewis.
Wow.
And I went to the Kootenays stones to speak with my dad and to do some grieving there. And but then I was driving around, and I didn't know what I was going to do this day or that day or any day. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do today. I don't even know where to go. I'm just going to drive along this road. I don't even know what direction I'm going. And right then, this orange truck with Wilson written on it
Wow.
goes right in front of me. And I was like, oh, and I followed the truck. And I ended up in this really interesting town that I never would have gone to otherwise. And I went immediately to the museum. And that's where I met this woman who told me all these stories about the Wilsons, and how they were, how the Canadian government came over to Scotland and promised all these people all this new life. And then the people came over to Canada, and they were put on a farm, and it was 80 bazillion below. And then they couldn't leave Canada because there was no way to get back to Scotland. And I just thought that was an interesting story. Wow. And how it related to my family. Anyway.
But the concept of a truck that says Wilson.
Yeah, it's like, like life is.
It's like the universe talked to you.
And it is filled with signs and poetry all around, if you stop to see it.
One of Dennis's unpublished, he did a novel about 2 weeks in Oscar Wilde's life during Wilde's first visit to America, where he was kind of like the Rolling Stones. He's a big deal. But there's 2 weeks and they're not sure where he was. And so Dennis imagines where he was. But all through that book, he invents sort of Wildean sayings. But the one that stuck with me, he said, he has Wilde say, "Maps are for people who don't know where they're going." And your thing with the Wilson truck seems a perfect example of that. You were not following a map, but you knew where to go.
Yeah, like get lost.
Yeah.
Like really get lost. I really believe in getting lost in life. And sometimes when I was in places like Paris, I was by myself, and I knew I had a place to stay, but then I got lost in Paris, and I ended up staying in an inn somewhere that wasn't where I was supposed to be because I just never made it home. I know, you can find, when you're lost, you find so much.
Well, I guess so. I'm pretty tight-ass guy, so, but I admire people who can do that. It's hard for me.
We're all different here.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we just had a great interview with Tom Wayman, and I thank Tom for sharing this time with me. I really do appreciate it a great deal that you would come here. And we're in Vancouver. He just was here for 2 days, so I was lucky to be able to segue this into time with you.
Well, thank you. I feel honored that you want to include me in this wonderful series.
Well, it's going to be a fun podcast, and I think that the people that I've invited are kind of special so far, and So thank you.
Well, thank you.
No, thank you.
Later, agitator. In a while, bibliophile.